Good evening, everyone. So I understand the government has issued advisories for people to stay home. So thank you for being good Indians and disobeying authority and coming in person this evening. And to those of you online, hello. Now, I also want to say a word of support and thanks to the Asia Society. This book came out actually in January, February this year. So this is, I think, the 7th or the 8th Asia Society event I've done at various locations around the world, beginning in New York and coming up soon in Hong Kong and other cities in between. And the Asia Society is an absolutely vital institution. I think what is so special among its other contributions is the fundamental intellectual underpinning. I mean, when you go to the Asia Society, especially in New York or Hong Kong, you genuinely see the exhibits, the speakers, the programming that really covers the full geographic breadth of Asia. I think we all accept that we are in a secondary way Asians beyond our first and foremost, national identities, but there are almost no common cultural institutions that give, equal attention across the geographies and sub-regions of Asia. Only the Asia Society does that as even-handedly, inclusively, holistically as it does. So if you're not a member, this is a plug from my side as well. You should really actively support this institution. It's also, of course, because it's a network, and I see that firsthand when I do these events. There's even now a more and more active chapter in Switzerland, for example. So bringing the attention of the stories of Asia to audiences that are not traditionally familiar, making Asia part of their daily cultural and intellectual life is something that, again, Asia Society is carrying the torch on that and doing it extremely well. So I'm ever grateful to the Asia Society for hosting me, and especially here again today in Mumbai. So let me pick up on that point I was just making inadvertently, really, about geography. One of the things I say in the beginning of the book is most people just don't even know what Asia is. Asia, in fact, the word is not an Asian word. It's a European word, sort of derived from ancient Greek. Asians haven't had a word for Asia, so we had to borrow one, right? But when the ancient Greeks came up with the term Asia, they actually just meant Persia, because that was the furthest geography that they were, sort of consistently familiar with. So obviously, the irony being that when we in South or East Asia talk about Asia, we mean us and we don't mean the West Asians of Persia, whereas that's actually what was originally meant with the term. The truth is it's both and, right? Geographers do not dispute what Asia is, right? The funny thing is that we have come to adopt colonial cartography whereby we refer to the Arab world and Persia as West Asia, as the Middle East, right? And the real Asia is sort of South and East Asia. Sometimes when people say Asia, by the way, they also don't even mean South Asia. They think of that as a separate subcontinent as well. But again, that is colonial cartography, not geography, right? No geographer disputes that this is the map of Asia, right? Asia is the GCC countries, the Persian Gulf countries, all the way to the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Anatolian Peninsula, Russia to the Ural Mountains. That's all Asia. But, you find very little writing about it. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because we've got 20 years of books about Asia, right? I struggled to find a title for this book because Asia appears in lots of book titles. But if you look at the content of those books, they're pretty much 90% about China, right? With maybe 99% actually. And then a smattering of references to Southeast Asia, maybe India gets a mention, right? You don't really have a holistic picture of Asia, even though, this is one of my points of departure, in the past 30 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1991, you have had a much greater degree of interaction, a recovery, if you will, of interactions across West Asia and East Asia. And that's sort of, part of what is captured here. So I mentioned, the demographics are very important in all this, even without reference to the full Asian geography. As you probably know, you may have seen this image before, 51% or 50.1% of the Asian population is sort of captured in this circle. And what's important to remember about the demographic story is that not only is that true today, but that's always going to be true. And that percentage will only grow. You have fast-growing populations in Asia, and even though Africa is growing rapidly, it's still only 1 billion people, right? Whereas the full Asian geography is roughly 4.6 billion people today. So there's no question that this is where the demographic action is. But again, importantly, this is because the world population is actually leveling. If we were here 20 years ago, I'm not sure if you remember what global demographic forecast said the world population would rise to, but it was about 15 billion people, right? We had it completely wrong. Of all the predictions that experts in any field have made over the last 50 years, I'm hard-pressed to think of one that we were more wrong about than the global population forecast. Just a mere couple of decades ago, we all thought the world population was going to be 15 billion people. Now, that has been revised down towards 9.5 billion people. We're almost there. By 2040, 2045-ish, evidently it's not an exact science, we will reach that peak population. Therefore, again, at that point, when we reach the maximum number of people in the world, the majority of them are going to be here in Asia. So I think that's something that's different. Now, let me get back to this point about Asia and China, or Asia being synonymous with China. That, again, rests on a very false understanding of Asian economic history. So I wanted to retell that story in this book. And the story begins, of course, not at all with China. Because when, in 1949, after the end of World War II, China was in the middle of a civil war. Right? China was still very much a backwards peasant society. But Japan, meanwhile, really reinvented itself, as we know, after World War II, experiencing a stratospheric economic rise, the Japanese economic miracle, as we now call it. And within 25 years of the end of World War II, Japan had become the world's second largest economy. I think most people in this room probably old enough to remember when America thought that Japan was its biggest threat. Right, rising sun and all of that. So it's Japan that begins the Asian economic miracle sort of story. And then that's the first wave. The second wave is the tiger economies, right? Of course, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. These are the economies that also grew so rapidly at around the same time and piggybacking, if you will, on Japan. And they set the standard. These first two waves of Asian growth in the modern era set the standard which then China sort of awoke to and realized exactly 40 years ago in 1979 when China established Shenzhen as its first special economic zone, right? So the Chinese story begins exactly 40 years ago, right? It's not the beginning or the end of the Asian story, right? It is the middle, it's the midpoint. And this is important because if you're out there in the rest of the world explaining to people why Asia is important, and everyone thinks that it's all about China, 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 China. I love that YouTube video of Donald Trump. Have you seen those doctored videos where he just says China 55 times in a row in 50 different speeches? That's kind of the way the world thinks about Asia, right? Always learn to assume the worst about people's, knowledge of world affairs. So it's all about China. And that means, though, that if the Chinese economy slows, as it is, right, if there's tensions with China, as there are, a lot of people out in the world are going to throw the Asian story out with the Chinese bathwater. And you don't want that to happen, right? That's not good for India at all. You want people to understand that China is the midpoint of the Asian growth story. China benefited from the growth waves that happened before it, but there is a huge wave that is really just beginning. And I focus a lot of this book on the fourth wave of Asian growth. That's here, that's us, right? India is at the center of that, along with the Southeast Asian economies. Now here you have not just the 1.4 billion people of China. Here you've got the 2.5 billion people, all of South Asia, Southeast Asia put together. And every single country in orange has a younger median age than China, right? Except for Thailand is pretty close to China's median age. Faster growth rates, younger populations, attracting so much foreign investment, right? So this region, it's time for this next wave of Asian growth to have the stars aligned, to have its moment kind of in the sun. And that is sort of what's happening right now. But of course, it's not one country, right? It's more than a dozen countries, so they don't speak with one voice. They're not fully integrated with each other. So, obviously a lot of them are small, still very poor, high inequality. But the potential is there, the raw materials are there. And the story of this fourth wave of growth, similar to the growth of China. China's growth happened because they opened, but also because, of course, they attracted lots of investment from the more modern, mature, developed countries, right? For 40 years, the most consistent investors in China have been Japan, have been Taiwan, have been Singapore, right? Now here, what we see happening is that you have the Japanese here. You know, if you're in Vietnam, you can see the huge presence of South Koreans. In Thailand and other countries, it's also the Japanese, right? So there's a pattern whereby the rich and modern and developed countries start to invest in and sponsor the rise of the developing economies. And that's why it's important to understand economics as a regional phenomenon and not as a phenomenon of just competing national blocks. All we hear about all day is trade war this and trade war that. And it's this, you know, I don't know, like a jigsaw puzzle or a risk board version of economics that is sort of first grade level, which is kind of where the Trump administration is in its academic pedigree. Whereas in reality, right, economics is very much about regional trends and patterns and integration that help to stimulate that growth. And so you can't really understand what's happening in this fourth wave of growth without understanding the role of China in that, Belt and Road, trade, the supply chain diversion, and so forth. So these are actually cumulative stories. So now, just a couple of other points. If you look at Asia globally, you know, you should be looking at the Asian economies in purchasing power terms rather than in US dollar terms, because you get a much more accurate picture of obviously the domestic terms of the domestic role of the economy, the role of consumption in the economy, and so forth. So when you revise national figures of GDP for Asia, you see a massive upward revision. You know, out in New York, they're having this conversation about, you know, when will China overtake the United States as the world's largest economy? Will it be in 2029 or 2030? And the answer is it was 2017, right? Because in PPP terms, already you have a pretty substantial gap there. It kind of makes sense. It shouldn't be so hard for people to understand that you should measure an economy based on the currency that people pay for things bought and sold in their country made by themselves. Not so hard, is it? Right? Now, interestingly, India benefits most significantly from an upward revision, right? So, for example, here, of course, it's the race to 5 trillion. Is that what people are saying, right? When do we get to 5 trillion? It's like stop measuring things in terms that are not relevant to your own, you know, sort of circumstances, right? It's a nice branding exercise, but at the end of the day, you want to focus on, you know, what you're doing in your domestic economy. And fortunately, large domestic consumption-driven economies are quite, you know, more resilient to trade shocks. And of course, you can always do more to strengthen the domestic component of growth through infrastructure investment and reforms and so forth. ASEAN, again, is fractured, but the ASEAN GDP is larger than India's, with only half the population. So this sub-region of ASEAN gets very often ignored, but is one of the most significant economic regions in the world as well. So you see how important Asia is in there. Now you'll notice that I've colored in even Turkey and Russia and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and Iran in orange, right? Some of these countries, this is kind of one part of the geopolitical argument, places like Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, you know, have thought of themselves as either aspiring to join the West, you know, Western institutions have been dependent on Western economies, in the case of Turkey even wanting to join, you know, the EU and so forth. Well, today, if you look at, this is back when I was in college, but some of us still suffer from that kind of mental inertia. Today, if you look at Turkey and Russia and Saudi Arabia, these are not exactly countries that are, begging to join Western clubs, right? If anything, they have tilted quite substantially towards Asia. So, there we go. And this is part of the reason why. So in the last, 30 years, right? The last 30 years is so significant because the collapse of the Soviet Union enabled the strategic alignments, the Cold War pressures, the divide and rule kind of, geopolitical architecture of the world, the post-colonial system where countries like India had, deeper trade relations, with Great Britain, or even, political ties and with their own neighbors. In the last 30 years, that's when all of that started to change. And you can see it blindingly clear in the trade statistics, right? So I went back 15 years, 10 years, 5 years, and here you have the current data. The bilateral volumes between any pair of Asian countries or subregions has grown very, very substantially. So I brought in Russia. You can see the Russia-India trade, Russia-Southeast Asia, Russia-Saudi Arabia, Japan with the Gulf countries. It's all been growing, all up. Again, economics is about this broader optimization of land, labor, capital. It's about the complementarities that economies have with each other. And Asians have been, sort of not exploiting those complementarities until the end of the Cold War. And then, boom, you had the super cycle. Super cycle is is the period in which you started to have the surging commodities trade across the Indian Ocean, right? So now, of course, the Gulf countries sell way more oil and gas to Japan, China, South Korea, and India than they do to any Western country, right? Europe is in the midst of a big energy transition away, and in any case, it can get everything from Russia and the Arctic and Africa. The United States doesn't need anyone's energy anymore, right? So West Asia has become part of the Asian story. And you've had trade liberalization, right? Things like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership coming into effect this year. And of course, you have the Belt and Road as well, which is helping to link countries more closely together. So I expect all of these numbers to go up. Asia has all the people, all the industry, all the commodities, all the technology, all the capital that it needs, right? Asians can supply anything that any other Asian needs. What we're in the midst of is a process of adjustment, towards that ever more convenient reality. It doesn't mean that you shut out the West. If you want to buy an iPhone, go buy an iPhone. Right? You want to go study in the U.S., go study in the U.S. It's about open regionalism is what, trade economists would call it, right? Asia becoming more self-sufficient in logical, obvious, natural ways, but actually being very pro-free trade, right? The U.S. didn't join the TPP trade framework that it created, but Asian countries were happy to join, right, alongside Canada, Mexico, and others. Now, this exchange, this growing set of complementarities also applies to demographics. And this is something that people often don't study enough. Because, sometimes when we look at Asia, we say, oh, Asia is aging, right, so rapidly, because they see that Japan is aging, which of course it is, and they say China is aging, there's a caveat to that, and Korea is aging. But remember that Asia also has lots of young people, right? It's not just the oldest, but also the youngest region of the world. And China is, not just a country that's aging. When you have 1.4 billion people, you don't just have old people, right? We forget that China, which is the orange spike on the left, China also has more young people than any other country in the world, right? Because by definition, half its population is below the median age. So it still has 700 million able-bodied people age 45 and under. And hopefully you're not immobilized as soon as you hit 46, right? And of course the spike next to it is India, where you can see from the gray line a much younger median age, very large youth cohort as well. In the middle are all the ASEAN economies, other Asian countries, where you see very young median ages except for Thailand, but cumulatively a large youth population. And on the right is the West, right? Very old countries with no young people, right? So, in a nutshell, this is all of the countries in the middle range. That's the high growth engines of Asia, and you are starting to see a lot more demographic flows, right? You've got and in any country where manufacturing is growing, infrastructure investment is rising, like in Thailand or Indonesia or wherever, you've got loads of cross-border Asian migration going on, for example. In the aging countries, like Japan, there's significant reforms to encourage inward migration of youth, right, from countries to be nurses, caretakers, that kind of thing. Students, right, you have more and more English language programs in Japan, Korea, even China, so Asians will stay in Asia to get their education, right? So at all levels, we're seeing more and more demographic interaction as well. That helps to recover some of that kind of Asian awareness. So Belt and Road is also meant to accelerate that process. We think of Belt and Road as just infrastructure, but in China's articulation of it, it's also about people-to-people ties as well. It's funny because the Mandarin edition of this book came out a couple of months ago, so I was in Beijing, and I heard from a bunch of academics that, we're seeing a decline in the number of American students that we're getting here, but from the BRI countries, the student numbers are going way up. And it's funny because when you grow up in the US, you'll see lots of data charts about the world, and you'll see US, Europe, and ROW. And ROW stands for rest of world. So in the Chinese map now, you've got China, Europe, America, and BRI, which is for them the rest of the world, because you have like 100 countries that are members of BRI, and to them that's everyone else. And it's legions of Nigerians and Pakistanis and Russians and all sorts of people. I see droves of Italians, going to study in China and so forth. Again, more and more English language programs. So China is going to get people to come there and be part of the Chinese story and the Belt and Road story, no matter what the Western attitude towards it is. And the West is actually very divided about, Belt and Road, I should point out. European countries have been much more accommodating and have even joined it, like Italy has, or have kind of third country arrangements, some MOUs with Belt and Road and so forth. I think Belt and Road is overall, I'm a kind of, I guess what you would call an infrastructure determinist, right? I look at the 5.5 billion people who live on this map, and I see that almost all the countries are post-colonial or post-Soviet. I look at the tripling of populations like India since independence. I see the lack of infrastructure investment over the last 70 years, and I say, this is a heinous crime. This is a terrible oversight, right? People need the basics, right, of connectivity, And so I generally think that even if there's good debt and there's bad debt, there's lots of things that governments have spent on and screwed up and wasted money. But generally speaking, infrastructure is a necessary investment, especially in the countries on this map. It doesn't mean that what China builds, China controls, and that's the mistake a lot of people make. And I spent the prequel to this book, Connectography, from which this map is derived, kind of arguing that actually infrastructure is the category of public good and investment where just because one country builds it, it doesn't mean that they own it forever, right? Even if a lot of debt has been taken on in order to build it. Because what happens is if you do it right, you grow out of that debt, right? It becomes obviously a net positive kind of asset. You pay back those debts. One of the things that I've also noticed is that, because a lot of the countries that are, dealing with China in a very unequal way that they have to when it comes to Belt and Road, is that, these are post-colonial countries, of course. They're very suspicious. They remember the colonial experience, right? Or they remember the Soviet experience. They don't want to suffer the new colonialism. The more we tell these countries to watch out for colonial or neo-colonial debt traps, the more that awakening is cemented, and they go back to China and say, hold on, let's do this differently. We don't want $30 billion of debt. We don't want all Chinese workers. Let's make sure that this is done in a way that benefits us. So what you see, rather than portraying China as the new British East India Company, what you see is that one by one, China is actually, here we go. China is being forced to negotiate, and to sort of, modify its relationships, and what I see, and you don't have to read all these details, but country by country, you can't say that China is indebting these countries, it's taking them over, it's controlling their, economies and so forth. Just not true. What I see in a lot of countries is that China is being forced to accommodate because it needs them as much as they need it, right? And I think that, if this is a 50-year story, we're only at year 5. And it's too soon to say that Sri Lanka, for example, is going to become a Chinese pawn. Anything but, as it turns out, based on the awakening that's happened in this country and the political football that the Hambantota port has become. So don't have a linear view about China and Belt and Road. View it as a process that's just being kicked off now and will in fact be very competitive. So I'll just wrap up. I made a point earlier about Europe. I just want you to focus on the upper right-hand bar. It says 1.6 trillion. That's the volume of trade annually between Europe and Asia today. And whereas the U.S. is sort of retreating in some ways by not joining the TPP and even being hostile in trade policy towards allies, Europe is getting on board with Belt and Road. It has just passed an FTA with Japan. It wants to have an FTA with India eventually, with ASEAN. So that number, 1.6, is going to grow, right? So the opportunity for the future is very much this sort of Eurasian opportunity. So I'll just conclude with this. I'm not a historian, but I spent a lot of time delving into the previous eras of Asia's, again, sort of, integration, complementarity, Silk Road eras, what have you. And genuine historians who look at the 15th and 16th centuries, they use this term Afro-Eurasia. Beautiful term. I had never heard it until a few years ago. And what you find is, the pre-colonial patterns of interaction were so robust. There's an entire subfield of history devoted to looking at the pre-colonial Asian and African civilizational interactions and trade. And in many ways, Belt and Road, all of the members are these Afro-Eurasian countries. It's the Eurasian Silk Road and the East African in particular countries. And today, the majority of the world trade growth is happening along the Indian Ocean Rim. Fastest growing economies in the world are all in the Indian Ocean Rim. Most enthusiastic participants in Belt and Road are along the Indian Ocean Rim. So it is in many ways a return to this Afro-Eurasian world of the 15th and 16th centuries, which, the more you study and read about it, the more you can romanticize about it and think, wow, with such little technological capacity, how much interaction and knowledge there started to build up across Asian countries. And today, how much more we can do to rebuild this Afro-Eurasian sort of system. And so to me, that's really a call to action, because we shouldn't take for granted that the Asian story has succeeded. To me, it's really just actually beginning. It's just starting to take off. There's a very, very long way to go. We should not be too quick to declare who's a winner and who's a loser from this. Eras of history last, centuries, not just, decades or minutes. To me, we are at just a 30-year mark, right? This all really started to get going again when the Soviet Union collapsed. 30 years is a very, very short period of time. If history is any guide, this is actually going to be something of you could say a golden age again, with lots of, geopolitical bumps along the way, lots of small or larger wars and conflicts, right? That's also part of system building in many ways, is settling disputes through conflict. It happens, right? It doesn't derail the broader story of this kind of Asian resurrection and the development and deepening of this Asian system. So with that, let me stop and thank you very much again, and really look forward to the conversation with Manisha. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good evening, everyone. Thank you again on behalf of Parag and me for braving the rain. It's a terrible day, and I know how scared we Bombayites are. I almost nearly cancelled myself. I was like, should I go home? But thank you for coming. So Parag, let me start by asking you, through my 27-year career, I've heard politicians, journalists, media economists all talk about Asia and the rise of Asia in a common way as a continent which has great future potential. And I, as an investment banker too, have sold Asia the same way. But at the back of my mind, I've always wondered, how do you generalize for such a vast swath of people who are so different, think so differently, speak different languages, culturally diverse, neighbors who are actually squabbling with each other, India, Pakistan, China, Japan, more recently back home, Singapore, Malaysia. So when you see us, do you see us as a homogenous lot, which is united in what it's trying to do, raise income levels of its people, and give better standards of living, or do you see us as a divisive, multipolar lot, which a lot of the West criticizes us to be?
That's a great question, and I go to great lengths to point out that Asia is by far the most diverse region of the world, and for Asia to have a coherence that is worthy of analysis does not mean that Asia is unified and therefore easy to understand, right? In a way, we use these European models to apply to a non-European region. It makes no sense. Asia has always been the most diverse part of the planet and is going to remain that way. That doesn't mean that we can't find the commonalities or the complementarities. And so to me, that's what this is about. It's about appreciating the diversity of Asia, not homogenizing it in any way, shape, or form. In fact, the crime of homogenizing Asia is precisely what is so often done by outside analysts, and people who, again, either say, well, Asia, that's just China, right? Or Asia, you have all these, human rights problems. Or Asia, you're all poor, right? That's the homogenization that goes on. I'm trying very, very hard to systematically rebel against that, and still to say that there is a set of trends underway across Asia, and one of those trends is merely the participation in this Asianization. There is this mentality, I call it Asia first, and of course that's a response to Trump's America first. I wanted to call the book Asia First, and my agent put her foot down. She was like, nothing that is of any allusion or reference to Donald Trump will be used in the title of this book. But, you can see in every Asian country this sense that, yeah, I don't get along with my neighbor. I resent them. I'm jealous of them. However, they're doing something smart over here, maybe I should copy that, or I should really be getting more technology from Japan and less from, this fickle, suppliers in the United States where the Trump administration is putting in export controls, or this kind of thing. There's many reasons for countries in Asia to want to exploit the nearer opportunities more than they have for centuries, and they're doing it whether it's sort of conscious or unconscious. The hardest thing to do, I think, for me in this book was to get at this idea of what I call the new Asian values. How do you generalize across, democratic, Israel and, and Muslim Indonesia and throw in the Russians, Japanese, and Indians and say that there's something in common? And I actually tried to do that. And I talked about kind of, we have this tolerance for, or even a preference for technocratic kinds of government, right? A strong executive leader who has a vision for modernization. We give that kind of person, his name might be Modi, could be someone else, a very long leash, In the West, you don't do that, right? And the other is mixed capitalism, something, of course, you're very familiar with. There's obviously a high degree of not only tolerance but support for the idea of a state role in the economy in some way, steering or supporting national champions, whatever the case may be. So industrial policy and so forth. The third is what I call social conservatism. It's kind of incremental liberalization, not a sort of anything, anything goes, say whatever you want kind of thing. And you can see this with internet regulation policies and so forth. So it's difficult to generalize about Asia, and I don't want to generalize about Asia, but I want to say that there's a very, very high degree of learning going on across Asian countries that just doesn't get almost any attention. Maybe it's not sexy, and so forth, but it's perfectly logical that people would see what's happening right next door and to learn lessons from it. And this part of the book I wouldn't have written or even understood or known about if I hadn't relocated to Singapore a couple of years ago. But at the Lee Kuan Yew School, we have boatloads, plane loads of Indians, Chinese, Kazakhs, Saudis, Japanese, Indonesians arriving every single week, coming for boot camps on how to run a country. The biggest countries in the world come to the smallest country in the world to learn how to run their country. I know, because I teach those seminars, and so do all the faculty. And they do their tour of the Urban Redevelopment Authority and this ministry and that ministry and this university. So there is this huge amount of Asian kind of cross-border Asian psychology developing through all of this bilateral and multilateral diplomacy and visiting, and I think that's a positive thing.
Just going back to one of the slides, as you said, more than 60% of the world's population lives in Asia. It's going to be the case. Do you at some stage believe, or some level believe, that we've just become too populous to manage and forget growing? We have this perpetual debate in India, right? That should there be a more federal style of government? Because is it really even possible for the center to implement the kind of changes? How do you see it from your vantage point? Do you see us as just too big to manage, or you have more hope?
In terms of massive overpopulation, it's a particular, Chinese problem, Indian problem, and African problem, really. In China, it isn't so much a problem because they're actually experiencing demographic decline at this point, right? They're well past now peak labor force, massive aging population. The rural long tail is no longer accelerating into the cities the way it was before. There is still urbanization, but not at the intense level. before. But you're reminding me of the famous Khushwant Singh line, as we multiply, so do our problems. And there is that debate in India, where people have said, the demographic dividend, right, is this lovely term that people love to use as if it's an automatic phenomenon. Just having lots of young people is always a good thing. But, you have to have a much more complex approach to these questions than we used to, because now you have to factor in labor automation. This is not the 1970s where you just push young people into factory towns and that automatically generates growth, and you, lo and behold, become a middle-income country, and you follow this lovely linear pattern from an agricultural to industrial to a services economy. It's all been disrupted. Yeah, I think everyone in this room ought to know how little new net job creation there is in the BPO sector in India. We've counted on BPO to create whatever hundreds of thousands of jobs a year, and now I think it's zero. This is not exactly helping the agenda of creating 4 million new jobs a year. So is a demographic dividend a good thing? Well, no, not if you can't put it to work, right? And that's got to be the number one priority. So there are either sectors or specific demographics or portions of the population that are not, being, well, adequately, cared for, gainfully employed, trained, educated, and then they can become lost cohorts. And that happens in lots of countries. I'm sure you're all familiar with what's been happening in the Arab world in the last 10 years, right? So I think that there's two views of this. The demographic dividend argument has started to fall a bit flat, right? If you're not creating lots of jobs for them, that's more of a liability than an asset. And this is, again, something that China has done wrong and right. The one-child policy helped for a while, and then you start to shrink a generation, you get everyone to work that you need to, but then suddenly your dependency ratio begins to expand. Demographics is the hardest thing, right, as I was saying before, to forecast, and it's also something that is very dangerous to tinker with.
You actually led into my next question, which was really what you just said. The last 2 decades was really about the Western countries building up these large supply chains in India, China, Vietnam, really cashing in on the low-cost labor. Now that arbitrage is going away. Wages are rising in our part of the world. Second, as you said, automation and productivity. The model that worked for the last 2 decades is not going to work for us in the next 2 decades. How do you see it? Do you see Asia as being prepared for this new world, which is really about automation, about skills of workforce being upgraded? Do you see us being competitive? Do you feel positive? A lot of us are struggling, right? Because this whole Make in India was meant to be this very large platform of replicating a little bit of what China did. But I don't think that delta remains. I mean, just 20% of the goods that roam around the world are now going from low wage countries to high wage countries. So how do you make sense of this, Parag?
It's a great question again. And I often get asked, what was the most interesting sort of thing you learned along the way in researching this book? And the answer to that question is the answer to yours, which is that I had not appreciated the extent to which Asian countries have already transitioned into being services economies. Again, we have this idea in our head that you go from being an agricultural society to industrial era of employment, you get the bottom rungs of the supply chain and intermediate goods assembly, and then eventually, as you become richer, you become a middle income or wealthy country, and you have urban services economies and so forth, right? And again, that completely is broken down in a good way. So for me, the most interesting thing that emerged from the research is that just the data on the economic composition of almost all Asian countries, except for the commodities exporters, which of course are always going to be majority, basic industries driven. It turns out that even some of the poorest Asian countries, including India, are already majority services economies in terms of share of GDP, more than 50%. Right? So they're not following this pattern that you don't become a services economy until you become a rich, middle-income country. We're already services economies, right? Now, not only is the wage arbitrage still working to some extent, meaning just about every net new manufacturing job created in the world is in Asia, right? Robots are there in China and elsewhere, and even increasing here. So in terms of the number of jobs created in each new automotive factory in Thailand or Indonesia, it's less than if that automotive factory were built in 1980, but it's still there, right? So all the new manufacturing work in the world is still happening in terms of human labor in Asia. It's Africa that won't get any of it, right? Because by then all the robots will have taken everyone's job. But for now, Asia's still getting all of that. But it doesn't depend, Asian countries do not depend on that work the way they did in the 70s and 80s. As a share of GDP, it's already much less than it was, because it is already about urbanization, digitization, financialization in India. Even in poor countries like, Vietnam, Indonesia, that's where the growth is. It's already in the services sector. So, in other words, the economic structure, the composition in terms of share of GDP resembles a Western society, right? Like even a European country, even though they're much poorer. And that's where you see the potential to continue along these platform technologies that are universal, rapidly spreading. You see the data, and you see this certainly in your work. I mean, the percentage of the population that has access to financial products, because of the apps, online platforms, mobile banking, all of these things, right? You would expect these things, in our orthodox theory, these things don't happen until you have buying insurance. We used to say $8,000 US. Until that time, people don't buy car insurance. Now it's like 2,000, right? Because these things are now priced in cents, and in pesa, right? That's what's happening. So we are services economies, and we need to do a lot more of it. And that's where jobs also need to be created. And the funny thing is, people talk about the disappearance of jobs because of labor automation as if those are the only jobs that could have been created. Nonsense. The real deficit in jobs is in services, in healthcare, in education, in hospitality, in infrastructure. Those are the things that this country lacks the most. And robots don't do those things, and they're not going to do those things. So our problem is not a technological one. It's not an economic one. It's a political one, right? Where are our priorities? Because you could create millions of jobs where they're needed in education, millions of jobs in healthcare, right? And advance the services economy and have higher wages in those areas. It's a political choice not to do them, and instead to talk about robots taking jobs that no human being wants to do anyway. So the whole debate, to my mind, is apples and oranges.
So I read that you not just travel in offices in organizations like this, but you also backpack through the region, right? And when you backpack through the region, do you actually see huge disparities in Asia? Do you see the very rich coexisting with the very poor, countries in different stages of development? Does that worry you at some level? Do you feel at some level we are probably doing what, have this whole concern which the West has in terms of just a backlash that's happening today? Are you worried on that? I mean, coming just now as you did from Bandra to here, you saw the largest slum Dharavi and you see the high-end apartments, and we're all coexisting at this point. But at some level, is there a concern that we shouldn't go, we need a more egalitarian model for it to be sustainable?
No, it's a great question. I meditated on this a lot in the book because the whole inequality debate that has sort of obsessed the Western public and literature and media, tends to be conflated with the global priorities. And quite frankly, I just don't think that's true. And I know that quite a few analysts have sort of, articulated this position, and there's a narrative forming that says, hold on, let's not lose sight of the fact that poverty is the real issue here, right? You're not going to reduce inequality just by raising a marginal tax rate on super rich, right? The only way is to raise the floor. And raising the floor is the much bigger problem in Asia. Because of the 5 billion people in the region, at least 2 billion, are still considered extremely poor. But when I travel around Asia, I don't see, therefore, that people are obsessing about inequality, even though inequality is high. If Asia were a country, it would be by far the most spectacularly unequal region of the world. I think I point this out in the book. In America, they obsess about inequality. The richest state, median income, is Maryland, near Washington, D.C., $60,000 US dollars per capita median income. And the poorest is Mississippi, $30,000, 2 to 1. That's considered a savage degree of inequality. And now look, if Asia were a country, you'd have Singapore and Brunei over here, and you'd have Myanmar and East Timor over here. Guess what that income gap is? It's like 40 to 1. Okay, so the world has never seen inequality the way there's Asian inequality. Where's the revolution? Right? Where's the Occupy Wall Street? That's just not what our problem is, right? Because in America, you don't have 2 billion poor people. So let's keep our eye on the ball here. I quite frankly have a very significant academic beef with with the Western economists who have made everything about inequality, when that's really not the global problem. You know, to me, poverty is the problem. And what I like about many Asian governments and thinkers is that they haven't lost that focus. You know, they say, look, poverty, this is the way a business person might put it, not me, but they would say, you know, poverty is an opportunity, right? What about all these disconnected people? We have to, you know, get them connected to, plug them into the grid, get them in the economy, make them consumers, right? That's a positive attitude towards the stark reality of poverty and as a consequence, inequality. So I like to see that proactive approach that says, hey, don't forget the fact that actually we could be growing more, right? We are still very, our economic composition is still very narrow, and we have a lot of work to do. Therefore, we want to focus on reducing poverty. And I think that is the correct a fiscal and policy attitude towards this question.
So your message to Asian leaders really will be focused on growth, and the inequalities will, to some extent, simplistically take care of themselves.
Well,
you will grow out of this problem.
Yeah, I mean, growth can be, engineered though, right? I mean, I see over the last, 15, 20 years, you can look at a lot of emerging markets that have been darlings, but they manufactured their growth through, very loose credit. You can see this in, Turkey, Brazil, or whatever, but these bubbles kind of burst. So there's a way to do growth. Inclusive growth is now the term that I like. I favor this term, inclusive growth, for what we should be doing. So making sure your policies, are actually creating, access to opportunity, right? Creating that infrastructural foundation, creating the basic set of services in healthcare and education, employment, skills, access to capital and so forth that people need, and that would be it. So growth is not an end in itself, right? I mean, I think that this is where the, more holistic conversation has taken us in terms of sustainability and so on. So it's not, growth emerges from doing the right things. And the right things are the policies that are associated with the idea of inclusive growth.
Do you think ASEAN needs a higher consensus on human rights, rule of law, and other cultural aspects before it truly becomes great, like you've predicted in the book? Well,
I don't think you'll ever have a consensus on, sort of cultural things, right? So it's not really about that. One of the things that I, rebel against is, again, this overgeneralization about Asia. When people say Asia, it's this authoritarian threat from the East, the specter of Asian authoritarianism. What they mean, of course, is China. And the first thing I point out, and I would like you all to join me in this, is that, wait a minute, more people live in democracies in Asia than in the rest of the planet Earth. Fact. So please, let's all be clear the next time people conflate, India is still a democracy, with authoritarian China, right? More just in India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, that's about 1.8 something billion people, right? So more Asia is largely populated by democracies, and most Asians live in democracies, and may it ever be so. So let's remember that there isn't one Asian political model, and if there is one Asian political model, it isn't China's. And the more China acts like China, which is to say, entrenching authoritarian practices and, alienating many of its own people, and, being accused in some ways of attempting to export that model, which I don't really think it's doing, but anyway, the more it alienates its neighbors, the less they would want to be like China. Right, so Asia's future is not to be undemocratic, anti-democratic, and to be caught up in this sort of notion of a China model. Right, most 3.5 of the 5 billion Asians, 3.5 billion are not Chinese, are not in China. Right, so again, I hope this is all clear to everyone, but it's a point that a large majority of the global chattering class does not seem to understand, as basic as it is. So you have a vast diversity of regimes. I think the point you're making, really gets down to the self-serving nature of censorship and, certain kinds of, policies, against free speech and media and so forth. I certainly don't condone that by any means, right? In my private work, when I'm working with governments, I say to them, especially if it is China or elsewhere, I say, why don't you lighten up? You've been as most successful countries of the last 4 decades, have been some of these Asian countries that are still so harsh and authoritarian and abusing human rights. I say, that if you were to lighten up, give more of a release valve to your people, they would probably express more degree of gratitude, right? If you think about older Asian people, especially if you look at older Chinese or Vietnamese people who've experienced the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the Vietnam War, what Asian person wants to see another civil war, wants to see instability, wants to overthrow their government without knowing what comes next, right? We're pragmatic people. Because of this, this recent history. So I think that actually, governments should trust people more in the same way that people have been putting their trust in governments. And I also like to point out that Asians are not docile. If you look at Korea, the Philippines, even Indonesia, there's not many, there's obviously the opposite, there is China. But in democratic Asia, people are not afraid to throw their leaders out. And I think that's a beautiful thing, obviously, right? So, I know that in countries like India and elsewhere right now, there is this sense that we're on the fence. We're moving in the wrong direction. And I definitely sympathize with that view. But I think that there's a difference between the regime of the moment and the culture and the society. And that is something that hopefully is stronger and more fundamental.
So, Parag, moving on, 50% of the world's internet users live in Asia. China accounts for 40% of e-commerce transactions globally. India has 540 million internet users. Aadhaar, one of the biggest biometric programs in the world, has been adopted in India. Artificial intelligence is a big priority for Japan, China. 50% of the venture capital funding is coming into Asia from the world, and so on and so forth. Do you see this process of digitization and innovation really furthering what you're saying in terms of propelling Asia into and leapfrogging it into the next level of growth? And what do you think policymakers and corporations, etc., can do to really further this process of integration of technology into mainstream lives?
Well, it's a fantastic question. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about this leapfrogging, or second mover advantage, as it were. And there's no question that there's genuine innovation, in Asia, in each of the technology clusters that really matter for, either stimulating further economic growth and even, in a sustainable way. You can look at the digital era and digital platforms. There's no question that the WeChat ecosystem is the ecosystem, the platform par excellence, right? For the world. And you can see in Indonesia, they're taking bits and pieces of the super app models from China and elsewhere through Gojek. Gojek has become the super app for Indonesia, and every country in Asia is developing these super apps. And I have a line in the book that may seem cruel for Americans. I say, in America, you still write checks, and people line up at banks to deposit their checks, and it disproportionately disadvantages poor people, right, who have to spend all that time, and then, they have to get payday loans at usurious interest rates. And so I say, the best thing that could ever happen to poor Americans is to have WeChat, right, which they don't have, of course, because, when you have the second mover advantage, like you have in Asia, you can write regulations from scratch. You can have the telcos and the banks and the regulators understand each other on the fly and really enable this sort of ecosystem development. So I see that the room to do more of that across populous Asian countries is enormous, right? Because you don't have a WeChat for the Philippines yet, and here in India we could do more of that, and so on. So huge. That's just one area. Then look at healthcare costs. This is something that is exciting, of course, in India as well, right? The cost of delivery. I have exact specific numbers in the book. The cost of delivering, a decent health, suite of health services in a clinic or remotely is obviously a fraction of what providing medical care is in a Western country, right? And so even poor Asian countries, like, say, Indonesia, India too, can push for this legislation to have universal access to basic health care for populations, even in remote areas. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. And this is indigenous innovation. Health Cube is an Indian sort of thing, right? Then you can look at off-grid power, you can look at the biomass, now what's happening with the solar, solar technology, other things in the biomedical space. So in every single technology cluster, you can see that there are Asian leaders innovating, building national champions, commercializing, spreading across borders. SoftBank is helping, of course, with a lot of this. That's happening. So, and as you say, whatever the category is, even when it's mobile phone penetration, internet usage, which is like low-hanging fruit at this point, penetration is still not as high as it could be. It's not universal. It's not 100%, right? It's still a long way to go. So, in other words, by focusing on this, the way the private sector is and some governments are, we're getting, moving faster and faster towards that universality. But again, still billions of people that are not yet connected. So, is that a reason to be on the whole, optimistic about the domestic, economies and the growth opportunities across Asia? Of course it is. It's enormous reason to be positive. And that's why, there's blips and there's trends, right? I mean, there's corrections in our statistics and projections around growth in India, downward, China, downward. But, look at the bigger picture. Look at the upside that is inevitably going to be harnessed, and it's huge.
Moving to the corporate sector, Asia's created some world-class organizations, tribals like Samsung, Hyundai. China's created world-class banks like CIC, ICBC. Singapore created a world-class bank like DBS from a small country. How important has the role of these corporations been in the Asian growth story? And do you think to some extent they're unsung heroes?
I don't know if they're unsung heroes in the sense that, if you're in Korea or Japan, I mean, Toyota and Samsung pretty well, right? So that the model of building the corporate city, the kind of, the full supply chain ecosystem in one geography has been a critical part of your country's rise, and it still is obviously a critical, factor in these countries' economic foundations. And the thing is, again, those started out, poorer, the smaller countries and so forth. China has done it in a big country way, but it's hard to replicate that. Could there be more of that in India? Of course, right? But in some ways, no one has stopped India from doing it. This is there's a pretty long list of own goals in India, right? Things that should have been done better and haven't. Sort of where's the Alibaba of India and all these kinds of things. And again, it could be regulatory, it could be capture, it could be the lack of quality infrastructure. I always say Alibaba, we talk about as $400 billion or whatever company, but Alibaba couldn't have become Alibaba in China were it not for the national infrastructure platform. You can't promise to deliver anything anywhere in the country in 24 hours unless you have really good airports, roads, railways, and so forth. So you can't have an Alibaba. You can't have an e-commerce company as successful as Alibaba in India until you have all the bricks and mortar too. So we talk about these companies as if they're wireless and tethered and digital and point and click and order. Well, no, it rests on a certain foundation of infrastructure first. Right, so India has to provide those things for the companies to achieve that universality and scale quickly. So there's a lot of scope for India to do those things. And again, hopefully the companies that do play that role are efficient private companies because I don't think that what we're seeing in terms of state intervention, right? Picking winners, it doesn't always work particularly well, in a country like India.
So I have a lot more questions, but I've been told to stop and give others a chance. So I'm going to stop now and ask the audience to just ask your questions. There'll be a mic going around. Please introduce yourself and ask the question.
We're going to be here.
Yeah. Hi, good evening. I'm Professor Devraj Ghoshal from SPGN Management College. I teach strategy and international business. So my question is, Asia is a big opportunity we all know about. Can you talk about 3 or 5 countries which are particularly more opportunity in the next 3 to 5 years? Because business school students want to know, hey, where is it and which sector? Yeah.
Sure, no, that's a very good question. And I think, well, there's opportunity in terms of where you might sort of physically go versus where, you should see from I can just give you the kind of macro, sort of structural answer. But what I've seen, obviously, with the, as I said earlier, the trade war has really accelerated the diversion of supply chains into ASEAN, so much so that there's now talk about labor shortages in ASEAN countries, which are very large, like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. Imagine these countries of more than 100 million people having labor shortages with their young populations and full employment. That's how much work there is, and these countries are very open, to new trade liberalization frameworks and so forth. So there are those countries like the Vietnams and Thailands and Indonesias and so forth that are really in that sweet spot. So there's no question that they're going to see very strong growth. You also have, consensus in those countries about where policy needs to go in terms of infrastructure and education and so forth, social policy. So I think that, these mid-size, countries are going to do very, very well in the coming years. Again, this just happens to be that confluence of factors that are really driving these economies forward, no matter what the global conditions.
Good evening, I'm Sheba. I'm a consultant, and I've been following the Scandinavian nations in terms of the renewable energy space a lot. Now, looking at Asia specifically, Japan is quite a leader in this market. What do you think is India lacking in terms of maybe learnings or probably even adopting any policies per se in the same space, and something that we should probably learn from Japan itself?
Sure. I mean, every large economy with, a lot of now, oil, gas consumption, coal, obviously, and so forth, could learn a lot from countries that use these resources either in extraction or consumption in a more sustainable way, right? So whether it's carbon capture storage, whether it's in the broader alternative renewable space, nuclear power and lower cost and efficient reactors. Obviously, there are things that can be done. A lot more can be done in solar in India, even solar mass. So using solar cells to capture air, fresh water. Biomass obviously is a big opportunity in India. So there are things that you can learn from Japan, things you can learn from China, right? Low cost electric vehicles, all these sorts of things. I mean, India should be, the technologies are all out there at this point, right? I mean, obviously there's refinements going on in every single area, but there's at some level no excuse for applying the knowledge that we have, whether it's coming from Japan or from the US or Europe and elsewhere, to be adapting our energy systems and moving towards lower carbon kinds of economic models. And then there's things that India itself obviously could do based on the resources that it has available. And so, definitely looking at obviously the air pollution in Indian cities and the CO2 emissions and so forth, a very, very long way to go in terms of what India needs to do to adapt its economy.
Parag, firstly, congratulations. I think it's a fascinating book. But I have a less rosy view about China. I think the view that you presented, which is the Belt and Road being a benign apparatus, is actually exactly opposite to the view that India holds for a variety of reasons. And I wouldn't mind you giving a reaction to this. The essence of Belt and Road is about China's overcapacity, and then it trying to impose its own dynamic on other nations. And as you rightly pointed out in the 4 phases of approach, the worry we have in India is that China's way of life, which is top-down, dictatorial, authoritarian, is going to be imposed on the rest of Asia. And we, for sure, as India, are going to oppose that. So any views on that?
No, I mean, obviously I'm very familiar with the Indian perspective on Belt and Road, but it's obviously very parochial. Belt and Road actually, exporting Chinese overcapacity is really just a convenient, sort of excuse. It's just a convenient sort of step along the way. It's not the principal motivation. The principal motivation for Belt and Road is the Malacca trap. Right, the fact that China has to import the vast majority of its commodities through the Straits of Malacca and has to export the majority of its finished goods through the Straits of Malacca. That is the beginning, the middle, and the end of the motivation for the Belt and Road Initiative. In other words, it has nothing to do with India. It has nothing to do with being becoming a new neo-mercantile and neo-colonial power. All of these things that we accuse China of doing. It's pure geography, right? So it's completely secular in its origin. Furthermore, related to that, it actually began as a defensive thing. In other words, because China is vulnerable to this Malacca trap, right? It therefore needs to diversify its trade corridors and routes. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, they said, well, let's settle our borders with the post-Soviet republics. Let's start to build pipelines and get energy from the Caspian Sea rather than relying just on the Persian Gulf. Let's strengthen our ties with Russia and all of these kinds of things. And let's have 4 or 5 geographic corridors to access resources rather than being subject to just the Malacca trap. Again, purely defensive, purely secular. Has it become something where China not only wants to procure resources from Africa and Middle East and elsewhere, places that are beyond its scope of military, dominance, which is very, very, very tightly circumscribed, and therefore China wanting to use political instruments, financial instruments, economic leverage to ensure that governments act in a way that's friendly towards it and suit its interests? Absolutely. Wouldn't you do the same? Of course you would, right? But time after time, and the accusations that China is practicing this debt trap diplomacy have been actually disproven. And this is very, very simple to understand. If you are a country like Tajikistan or Mongolia or whatever, you were a heavily indebted poor country prior to China extending more loans and credit to you, right? You were dependent on mostly one, maximum 2 creditors prior to China coming in, right? You may have a marginal expansion of your outstanding debt to China, but you already had a high outstanding debt. My argument is at least now you're supposed to be investing it in a productive asset, right? Rather than simply siphoning it off to bank accounts in London, right? And China, if anything, is trying to actually get tough on some countries to make sure that they make good on the investments that they're supposed to be doing, because it's actually meant to increase China's geographic resilience, right? So is there a sly neo-mercantilism going on? Absolutely, right? One of the things that most angered Pakistanis, for example, was when some memo was leaked from the Urumqi provincial government that because every Chinese province has to have its Belt and Road strategy. So the Xinjiang province's strategy was, well, let's buy marble for cheap from quarries in Pakistan. Let's polish it, finish it, and build really nice furniture and ornaments, and let's sell it back to Pakistan. So when this was leaked, in the public and published and translated into like Urdu or whatever, they went nuts. They're like, we're not going to be subject to your neo-mercantilism. Again, as I've been saying all along, we remember colonialism. To hell with this, right? And you had, China backtracking and backpedaling, and we're not going to do that. Don't worry, we promise. One of the things that China is doing right now, especially in light of the trade war, in response to the trade war, is to massively reduce import tariffs to almost any and all countries that are not named the United States of America, right? Now, it was trying to do a bit of that anyway in order to give the semblance of a more equitable, sort of trade, because what tends to happen, I've been looking at economies like Brazil and others for like decades, where they started out having a trade surplus with China. They're like, rah, here we are. We're, China's open to us. We're a strategic partner. We're, sending huge amounts of raw materials to them, and their imports to us are not that bad. But then 5 years later, it's like, oh no, massive trade deficit, with China. And so China's saying, okay, how are we going to make sure that these countries don't turn against us, right? So what you're seeing happening is that even if China does have utterly nefarious intent, let's say everything you're saying is true, this is meant to be the new British East India Company in every way, shape, and form, right? And they're mercurial and exploitative, neo-imperialists. Let's just pretend for a minute that Indian conspiracy theory about Belt and Road is true. It still doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen, right? Because that's not at all what's going to happen. The pushback to everything that China is doing is more important than what China thinks it's doing and wants to do. And that's where you see the importance of what's happening in Sri Lanka, right? you think you've got a port. It's like, let's say the Chinese were thinking, yes, we build this port, we've trapped the country in debt, they were about to default, we've got this 99-year lease, let's start sending some nuclear-armed submarines there. Woohoo, right? We're going to control the Indian Ocean. All it takes is one election in Sri Lanka to rip all your plans up, right? And then Prime Minister Modi can show up in Colombo, and suddenly, the next sets of deals are going to go to India, and you'll never have a pro-Chinese government in Sri Lanka again. Right? So you don't make a linear projection of these things. Countries where you see Pakistan, where you see China dominating, will turn against, China. The first sets of deals and contracts will go to Chinese, but as they mature and gain confidence and reduce their debt and achieve investment grade, the next set of deals will go to countries with higher standards, right, and higher quality, right? You'll start to see that too. So this is, again, a 50-year story. I have used the word multipolar earlier. If I can just remind you, my central argument is that 4,000 years of Asian history, Asia has almost always been multipolar. Only one power has ever dominated the majority of Asia, and that was the Mongols. It was a really long time ago. The Chinese are not the new Mongols, right? Whatever China wants, we make this mistake of believing that, well, it's China. They always get what they want. They have a 1,000-year plan. They're so ruthless and focused. The answer is no Asian power ever gets what it fully wants because Asia is so big, so diverse. It's civilizations so self-confident and able to deter each other that no one ever wins in conquering Asia. No empire can extend its hegemony for particularly long. China has never done it. The Japanese failed miserably. And the Mongols were nomadic, right? We don't have any nomadic civilizations anymore. So, I just want people to remember that the backlash to Belt and Road is as important as Belt and Road, and it shapes Belt and Road. So whatever China wants doesn't matter nearly as much as what others want. So listen not to what comes out of Beijing. Listen to Islamabad and Tashkent and Astana saying, hold on a bit, or Yangon. We don't want this much debt. We don't want you bringing all your workers. We don't want you dominating our economies, right? Because they're gonna win, even though they have no leverage. They seemingly have no leverage in the power dynamic with China. But China needs them as much as they need China.
Thank you, Parag, and thank you, everyone. I don't think we have time for more questions, and I can assure you all your questions will be answered in this book, copies of which are available outside. I read the book myself. I couldn't put it down, so I highly recommend each one of you take a copy as you go. Thank you, Parag. Thank you for a really stimulating conversation, and look forward to writing more books, and more power to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.